Hello, and welcome back to How to Change the World, the podcast that equips change makers with the insights, tools, and inspiration that you need to drive meaningful impact. I am Catherine Alonzo, and today it is my supreme honor to get to talk to Mini Timmaraju, who is the President and CEO of Reproductive Freedom for All, previously NARAL Pro-Choice America. This is a real personal one for me. The ability for everybody to have autonomy over their own choices of their own body, I think is just such a fundamental human right that the fight over abortion access that has really taken hold in the last few years in America, ever since the overturn of Roe v. Wade, is just so incredibly critical. And I think one of the movements that we can look to learn so much about how you fight to change the world. And like I said, for me, the access to abortion is just such a fundamental human right. The ability to make choices over your own healthcare and your own body, that it touches every single one of us. It's not a quote unquote women's issue. It is, in fact, an issue of how we make decisions, how we live in relation to each other, and how we build our communities. And I think one of the most important issues of our time. And so it was just such a pleasure for me to be able to talk to Mini, and I am so excited to share this conversation with you. Mini is the first woman of color and immigrant to lead Reproductive Freedom for All. She has 25 years of experience leading efforts to advance not only reproductive rights, but also gender justice and racial justice. Under Mini's leadership, Reproductive Freedom for All has been on the forefront of the political response to the Supreme Court overturning Roe v. Wade. And just Mini's passion and insights, I learned so much and truly feel inspired and reconnected to the fight, having had this conversation. And so I am so excited to share it with you. Without any further ado, my conversation with Mini Timmaraju. Mini Timmaraju, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
I am so excited to have this conversation with you and really grateful for your time and your energy. So thank you so much for being here. To kick us off, tell me about you, your background, what your day-to-day work is, and then how you got to the work.
So that's really great questions. I am an Indian immigrant. My parents immigrated here from India in the late 60s, but I've been here since I was an infant. And we first came to the New Jersey, Philadelphia area. Then my parents moved to Texas, and I spent most of my life in Texas. So I'm really, I'm an immigrant, person of color, woman who grew up in all my formative years, all the major parts of my life in the Houston, Texas region. And it really does shape a lot of my perception of race, class, social justice, civil rights, all of the things, if you can imagine, right? Like being in those intersections. And, I grew up very acutely aware of all those issues I just mentioned, race, class, equity, in a very political family in terms of my family back in India. So I always knew I was going to do something in the public interest. And, I think those of us who are women of a certain generation and age, I'm Gen X, many of us got involved in the feminist movement because we were right at that cusp, right? Where everything was really supposed to be promised to us. We were probably that first test generation, like we're graduating, we assume we have all the same resources. And then you come out and you're like, oh, wait a minute, I don't have equal pay. Oh, I don't have equal rights. But I was told I did. And it does kind of radicalize you. And I think it's a common story for many women of certain generations. But that is probably the entry point for how I ended up working in the gender equity space and the civil rights space. And most of my career has been sort of toggling between those two and the public interest and government and nonprofits.
Was there a specific moment that really solidified your commitment to abortion advocacy?
Yeah. I was a teenager when a very close friend of mine needed an abortion in Texas. And my mother, who I really never talked to about sex, because we're Indian immigrants, right? Never talked about sex, never had the birds and the bees talk, did have the birth control talk because I had endometriosis and I ended up needing birth control for a host of other reasons, but didn't even date, wasn't even really allowed to talk to boys on the phone. But I had this really close friend who was white, who came from a single parent household, who had gotten into some trouble. And my mom was like, oh, we're going to take your friend to the doctor and help her. And I only pieced it together later what it was that happened.
Mm.
But I remember many years later having this conversation with my friend, and she was like, you know, I didn't have anywhere else to go, and your family has always been so helpful to me. And I was like, oh my God, like that. I don't know that that was the moment I decided to focus on abortion, but that was one of the moments where I started to realize the connection between access to care and that it doesn't necessarily mean your socioeconomic background, right? I mean, this was a white girl who lived in my same neighborhood, upper middle class neighborhood. If anything, you know, we were similar economic backgrounds, similar education levels, similar, and she had privilege, right? She was white, but she didn't have two parents at home who were paying attention to her, right? She didn't have the family supports that I had. So the other part of my childhood that sort of radicalized me towards gender equity and abortion, that was like my first awareness of abortion. You know, and then going to college and realizing how challenging birth control access actually could be, which was another sort of radicalizing moment. Why isn't this easier? Why is this so hard? Was the fact that my mother, again, all of these stories go back to my mother because she's the first feminist in my life. When I was a child, there would always be these random aunties who would end up staying in our house for like a couple of weeks at a time. And it was only later in my, you know, college years that I pieced together that these were all women who were fleeing domestic violence. And my mom was part of like an unofficial community of women helping other women. And that my father was progressive enough to be like, I'm not going to ask any questions. You do what you got to do. And if somebody, you know, needs help, they need help. And if they're a country person, like they're one of us, we help them. Right. But all of those pieces together, you know, when you're in your formative, you know, teenage years, you start to learn some basic lessons that you don't even know you're learning, which is that we as immigrants, but particularly women, we cannot survive without community. And that part of being a part of a community is serving each other and taking care of each other when we're vulnerable. And these women who were showing up, they weren't like, you know, in tatters and, you know, covered in bruises, or there was nothing out of the ordinary about them. They just needed a place to land while they were grappling with a tough situation. So fast forward, you know, I'm in college. I'm like a student activist at University of California, Berkeley, and then came back to Texas for law school. I started volunteering almost unconsciously in the domestic violence movement. And that's a place where very quickly you start to see the connections between bodily autonomy and, you know, personal safety, right? The most dangerous time for a woman is when she's pregnant for two reasons. It's one, because pregnancy is dangerous and we don't talk enough about that, right? And that's why no one should be forced to carry through a pregnancy or even be pregnant, because it could literally be life or death just from the act of pregnancy. But the other is, in many domestic violence situations, things really ratchet up in terms of violence in the home when you have a pregnant partner. So I learned very quickly firsthand as a law student doing legal advocacy in the domestic violence space. I had many clients who were domestic violence victims. I would go to the domestic violence organization and volunteer time as a legal advocate to guide women through their court experience. And that was when everything started clicking in my brain. Like, oh gosh, this is a whole world where I can be helpful, where I have unique empathy and skill to really be a meaningful support system for these women. And yeah, I think that was probably, I don't know that it would have happened that quickly if I didn't have some sort of subconscious exposure to these issues when I was younger, you know?
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. I loved how you said that you're learning so many lessons in your formative teenage years that you don't even realize are lessons. It's so true. It just like,
right.
It so much that happens around you and to you when you're young turns into what you care about and what you do for work, and how you how you live your life. And so rarely are we really aware of those connections.
Yeah.
And I think it's actually a real privilege to be able to sort of reflect and think like, where do those things come from?
And it's a
What's the
privilege
story
to be
for
able
me?
to do something with it.
Yes.
Right. And not just sort of unconsciously be like, oh, I had parents who were really lovely people, and then I went off and did something else.
Yes.
I got lucky. Everything's a lucky accident. Every career, whether no matter how intentional you are.
Right.
And I got lucky that I kept falling into opportunities to like take those lessons and apply them to real life.
Yeah, I really love that. I love that a lot. So let's talk a little bit about sort of the current moment, because advocacy is hard. When you're fighting for equity and access and rights, that is really difficult work. And it's really difficult work when it can feel like you're losing.
Yeah.
So how do you keep going, especially in the challenges that we're experiencing right now?
So the benefit of age, as I age, and I'm going to be 52 in about 2 weeks, is we've been here before.
Yeah.
I like I said, I'm from Texas. I started my career in reproductive freedom and reproductive rights in Texas. I was a lobbyist for Planned Parenthood in the Texas legislature when they first passed the first mandatory ultrasound bill, when they had passed the 72-hour waiting periods, where the legislature had created what they called corporate separation, where family planning centers had to be separate from abortion centers, all designed. These are what we call targeted restrictions against abortion providers, trap laws, designed to just make the job of abortion really hard, right? You can't ban it outright under Roe. So we're just going to make it really expensive, complicated, and cumbersome, and create as many barriers to care as possible. So I was in Texas working in the movement during that period of time, post Planned Parenthood v. Casey, the rise of evangelical activism, and watching it all kind of happen in real time. So I was there in a worse environment when it was all happening, before I left to go work at the national level for Planned Parenthood. And I was really lucky to work directly for Cecile Richards as my first job from Texas to the national stage, and watch, sort of this masterclass for how you fight for these rights, And Cecile had also started in Texas and started Texas Freedom Network and all of these great organizations because of the rise of evangelical activism, because of the rise of the extreme right. So Texas in many ways is sort of that crucible of where some of the worst stuff happened, including SB 8. That was just before Dobbs. And so we've been here before. I mean, I have literally been there before. My team has been there before. So this is horrific. But unlike a lot of progressives or Democrats, this is like our second or third time dealing with this in our short careers. So I'm not saying that means it's not painful or it's not demoralizing, but you got to look at the arc. You've got to look at the longer arc of rights and freedoms, and we don't win rights and then stop fighting, right? We've won some fights, we've lost some fights. And when we think about these fights as linear, we're making a mistake, right? It's not linear, it's more cyclical. Like you're going like, I'm making emotions of folks that are in the listening podcast are going to hear this. It's more like 2 steps forward, 1 step back. It's not a direct line. It's like steps. And it's important to understand that, or you can get really caught up in we lost and the hopelessness of the moment. Now, that being said, the moment we're in now is quite demoralizing and horrific. But as many folks smarter than me have said, probably on your show and other places, it's by design. They want us to feel hopeless. It's one of the reasons why I keep telling our supporters that the opposition likes to gaslight us into thinking we're the minority on abortion access in terms of support. Like, oh my God, only the most radical people in this country think abortion is great. No, actually, 8 out of 10 Americans support a legal right to abortion, even if they may personally have discomfort with the issue. And they support it because post-Dobbs, they now understand that it can mean death. The original point I made about a pregnancy being so dangerous, anyone who's had any experience with pregnancy or is close or loves someone who's had an experience with pregnancy understands nobody should be taking a fundamental right to save their own life or save their own bodily autonomy, right? So they like to bully us into thinking we're radicals, but they're radicals. And when we look at the data, you can feel confident in the fact that we're the majority and the Americans are with us, despite the manipulation of the extremists who've taken over our government.
Mm. And so in this current moment, how is success defined for you in your work? Because to your point, not only do 8 in 10 Americans support abortion access, but there have been a lot of wins for abortion.
Yes, here in Arizona.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
So
Arizona is a state where we have legal access to abortion.
And we did it through, and I have a chapter there and some really incredible staff in Arizona and organizers. We collectively did it together through the power of organizing. So there were 10 ballot measures last year. We won 7 out of 10. 3 were very undemocratic ballot measures. 1 was in Florida where the threshold was 60% and we got to 57%. Ugh. You know, the other 2 were competing ballot measures in very, very radically red states. So we didn't have like a fair and square shot to win those fights. So one of the ways that we measure wins is by looking at other ways that abortion and reproductive freedom won. So we know now very definitively that in the majority of cases, when we take this issue directly to the people, we win. That's a huge sign. That's a huge part of the narrative that abortion in many ways is more popular than members of Congress and our elected officials and our governors and our legislators. But the other way that we've been able to show success is how we've been able to expand access and rights in the parts of the country where we do have reproductive freedom majorities in legislatures. So I'm thinking about places like New Mexico, you know, where Governor Lujan Grisham has dramatically expanded reproductive rights and abortion access on the border with Texas as a response to Texas banning abortion. I'm thinking about states like New York and California that have initiated shield laws to protect their doctors who are being right now in real time sued by states with abortion bans like Louisiana and Texas for providing care to folks out of state. There is an incredible surge of support in the public for these issues, as we can see through the polling and the elections, but there's also been a tremendous expansion of rights in places where we have the levers of power. And that matters too, because that allows us to, in this moment, care for the most number of Americans as possible.
Yeah. And when you think forward, let's say 10 years, where do you see the movement being and what do we have to do together?
Yeah, 10 years is a while. I can tell you what I think we need to do now and then what we have to do 10 years. You know, our opposition, the anti-abortion movement, the extremist, you know, evangelical Christian, I'm doing air quotes around Christian because so many Christians are with us, right, is really good about planning way ahead. So one of the things we started doing immediately around the Dobbs decision is convening all of the other reproductive rights, health, and justice organizations, start thinking about what our long-range plan is. You know, it's not enough just to pass these ballot measures. We've got to be thinking about a bigger, bolder vision of abortion access and care that includes folks who are undocumented, that includes folks on the margins. We need to get rid of discriminatory barriers to care, like the Hyde Amendment that prohibits federal funds from being used for this care, because that disproportionately affects folks who are, you know, financially on the margins, which, let's face it, those are Black and brown folks in this country, or, you know, immigrants, those are LGBTQ folks, those are folks in rural areas. Many of them are veterans. So we're looking at comprehensively, what are all the ways at the state and federal level, like I was talking about in California, New York, Minnesota, and, you know, Massachusetts, where we can really push for comprehensive care? And how do we also address, and we've had some big wins in this area too, access to birth control, access to contraception, access to IVF. You know, right before we lost this election, the Biden FDA was able to move to finally get birth control over the counter. Huge win that will actually save lives and prevent more abortion than any other right-wing ideological trap law will ever do, right? So how do we, as a movement, think about the long-term plan to recover those rights? So some might say you don't have the political will to do all those things. Some of those things are not in the scope of who you have in Congress. But if we don't start planning that now, we will never get there. And we won't, when we have that window where we can move some of these policies, we need to be ready right away.
And how is a leader in the movement for abortion access, do you balance those two things? Because it can be, I am completely on board with you. I completely agree. Like, we have to be planning for long-term vision now. We have to be. And I also know how much stuff is coming. And so how do you balance those two things?
Yeah. So I honestly, the first word that came into my mind when you asked, but when you started the question was divide and conquer. We can't all do everything. So our organization is an advocacy organization. We're not a healthcare provider. We don't, provide abortions. We're not abortion funds. We don't provide pills. We are, advocates in the legislatures. We're organizers. We work on elections. We work on shaping the public narrative. I do a lot of public awareness building around the issue, educating Americans around the issue. We have other important partners who are litigators, who are suing, the states, like our friends at Center for Reproductive Rights and ACLU. We have other partners like Planned Parenthood and independent clinics across the country that are providing that care. We have to work in coalition on the long-term plan and strategy, but we also don't need to be duplicating each other's work, right? So one of the ways that we balance everything is some of us right now are doing a lot of rapid response, around this Trump administration, and others of our colleagues, their version of rapid response is, making sure patients and providers can cross state lines without prosecution. And our part of that is, I'm not necessarily transporting the patient across lines or transporting the pills across lines, but I'm supporting the elected officials who are protecting and fighting for those patients and those providers. So the way that we balance it is we don't say yes to everything. We focus on our superpower, like what our specific, role is in the movement. And we are collaborative and we support our partners as much as possible. If I need to pick up the phone and talk to a donor or a funder or an ally and say, who calls me and says, Minnie, I need you to help us get pills across the border, I'll be like, there's a really good group that does that. And I want you to support them or give them money, not me. And that's important. We're in a 5-alarm fire, and it could be tempting to try to say we can do all of it, and we cannot. And I think that's also to, the larger question you were asking about leadership. I think that's important, not just as an org, but as a leader. You have to know your limits. You have to know what your skill set is. And you have to be willing to say, yeah, that's not my skill set. That's not my purview. And you have to be generous enough to know when to tag your colleagues in and to support them to do that work and not you.
I'm so glad you said that, because I think in the social change movement more broadly, it's such a disease that we see, and I get it. I completely get it. You see suffering, you see a problem, and you feel like you have to do it. Like, you can't sort of turn away because it's needed. And what I see with our clients time and time and time again is by saying yes to something that doesn't align with your superpower or isn't the most urgent need, you end up not serving as many people as you could in the long term, because you stretch your staff too thin, you spread your resources in too many places, and a really well-intentioned desire to respond and support people in the short term ends up causing other problems in the long term. And so I think that's more true now than it has ever been.
Yeah, and I think it's also so tempting, right, to try to do everything all at once for everyone, because the crisis is so big and you just want to help. And that's well-intentioned. But we are like any other, profession. You have to really have a sense of what are your limitations and what are your expertise. And you cannot, I think sometimes those of us who work in social justice or advocacy work, we see ourselves as, and I say this for myself and a younger version of myself, like, if someone needs me, I want to be there, right? If someone's asking me to do something, I should be able to do it. But, my father was an engineer, and if someone called him and was like, and he was a specific kind of engineer, he was a mechanical engineer. So if someone was like, hey, we need you to come fix our software system, he wouldn't be like, you know what, I should learn that and I should go fix it. He'd be like, no, I'm a mechanical engineer. I'm going to find you the engineer who does that. Right. I think it's important to remember we are subject matter experts, and we just cannot do all the things for all the people. And there is rigor and discipline that has to go into this work. And we have that too,
Yes.
That also takes some humility, but it also takes some discipline.
Discipline, for sure. It certainly does. Well, I want to ask you about the various different sort of groups and audiences that you serve in your work. Before we do, I'm going to take a quick ad break and then we will be right back. You seeking to create change at the polls? Us too. With Javelina's long history of running winning campaigns, we've learned a thing or two about mobilizing communities. And we know that success isn't about reaching every voter, it's about reaching the right voters. Head over to javelina.co today to sign up for a free consultation and learn how our tailored direct mail services bring voters into your story and drive your campaign to victory. So, Mini, what I want to ask you about is, in your view, who is abortion advocacy work for?
Everybody. I mean, I just spent some time this morning with our good friends at Men for Choice. It's a group of young men who advocate for abortion access. And I bring them up only because, you know, one of their main roles is to invite other men into the movement and to say, you know, for a long time, men were like, well, this isn't our place. It's their bodies, their choices. I mean, I don't have a skin in the game. Abortion advocacy is for anybody who cares about freedom. And it's one of the reasons why we changed our name and our brand from, you know, NARAL Pro-Choice America to Reproductive Freedom for All, because this is about fundamental freedoms. And it's not just about women and their bodies, you know, or non-binary people, pregnant people. It's really about anyone who has ever been part of a family, because this is about the fundamental freedom to decide if, when, and how to have a family. It's way bigger than just the act and the choice of, do I have an abortion or not, which limits, maybe in a very narrow sense, only folks who can get pregnant, right? Mm-hmm. But this is much more fundamental. This is about, if they can take away this fundamental freedom and this bodily autonomy from one class of citizens, every single freedom is at stake. So when Dobbs happened, the decision that overturned Roe v. Wade, you know, everybody has skin in the game now. It was really sort of the canary in the coal mine for what we're seeing now with the erosion of our entire democracy. If you can take a 50-year plus precedent away from the majority of Americans, you know, not just half the citizens, but actually the majority of citizens, what else can they take? And now we're seeing it in real time, what else they can take. So abortion advocacy is just one piece of a larger set of fights. And what I was really excited to see in this last electoral cycle is that there were lots of organizations out there in the field talking about abortion at the doors, on the phones, you know, everybody from Move On to Indivisible, you know, the big super PACs. And you could cynically say, well, that's because abortion was a winning issue. I'm like, well, yeah, but we also need everybody to understand, to the point I was making earlier, that abortion is sort of the canary in the coal mine, right? And it's an organizing tool now. Advocacy abortion is an organizing tool for all of democracy, because as Americans can personally connect the dots to what's just happened to them and their bodies and the bodies of the people they love, they can understand that there's so much more at stake. So it's for everybody.
And who are the people, it might be the same answer, but who are the people that we need to engage in the fight for abortion advocacy? And I think, you know, it obviously is everybody, but are there specific sort of subsets that you think we really
Yeah. You know, we spent a lot of time, we did exit polls, we've been in focus groups, talking to folks in Arizona, try to specifically understand voters who, take, for example, Arizona, they voted for the ballot measure. They might have voted for Ruben Gallego, but then they didn't vote for Kamala Harris. Like, what's going on there, right? So we have to really dig in to understand what happened with those people. And those people are not, they kind of cut across every demographic. So it isn't everybody, but it's, think about it this way. We lost a certain percentage of young men in this country for the first time. We lost support among young people. And by we, I mean the Democrats. Mm-hmm. We lost swing voters in key battleground states. But we lost communities we just had no business to lose. We need to organize across all demographics where we lost, but we also need to dig into, like, what was the reason we lost. In some cases, what we're finding is voters who would theoretically be with us on the issue of abortion didn't get enough information about what was happening. And it wasn't for a lack of money spent. It was this whole information ecosystem challenge we're having right now. There's a growing generation and growing population of Americans who don't get their news from traditional sources. And while we've done a good job of pushing out a lot of cultural content although we could do a lot better, and there's a whole other, podcast worth of conversation around how the right is co-opting young women aggressively to turn them off against birth control and, careers. This whole movement to push women into traditional wives lifestyles is alarming because it's a backdoor way to get them to stop advocating for equal pay and bodily autonomy. And that's very smart. And it's a long-term play. We need to do more of that. But we also need to make sure we're cutting through the noise to reach the audiences that we've been taking for granted. We were always like, oh, young people are with us. Well, they're with you if they know the stakes. But if they're just not hearing anything about the stakes and they're hearing everything from the other side, that's a problem.
Yeah.
If we are putting forward messengers who are not appealing to them, who they find condescending or off-putting, even if they support our policies, they may not support our candidates. So I think our traditional organizing as it is, the doors, the phones, the information, most of that messaging was spot on and effective, but it didn't reach everybody. And that is a newer dynamic. In the past, we're like, oh, you spent $1 billion on a presidential campaign, you've reached everybody. But we're not in the same world we were in even 6 to 8 years ago. I worked on Hillary Clinton's presidential. We were just starting to do things on social media. That was like a nice add-on.
Yeah.
But the bread and butter of political communication was television, newspaper, radio, and doors.
Right.
That's shifted. So, to go back to your point, it is kind of everybody, but it's everybody who is not reachable in other ways, and it's segmenting those folks out. I also think we're way overdue to get young men in this game. We cannot take them for granted. Erosion of young men is one of the most disturbing trends in this country for everything we care about, not just abortion. Everything.
Right. So when you think about the next sort of 2 to 5 years, what do you think is for abortion advocacy specifically, what do you think is the biggest messaging opportunity and the biggest strategic opportunity?
So the best messaging opportunity, or the best messages that test, and we use them in the ballot measures and we use them all over the country, is storytelling. And by that, I mean the firsthand experience of both women and men in red states and banned states with the erosion of their rights. So there's a fabulous project that my former boss started just about a year or two before she passed away, Cecile, called Abortion in America. They have a ton of great social. They're on Instagram, they're on TikTok, and they're basically dedicated to documenting in a high quality content abortion storytellers firsthand, telling their stories. The most persuasive content is first person narrative about what's happened to me because I lost this access, or what almost happened to me, or what happened to my child or my partner or my loved one because of this, and how I have skin in the game now, and I'm a fighter for this freedom now. So I think there's a really massive opportunity. What we cannot fall into is we only use these stories when there's an election.
Yeah.
And then in the year and a half in between, we don't talk about it. We have to keep these stories in the news 24/7 all year round, because in this new information infrastructure problem we're having, people don't get their information in one shot.
No.
You got to feed it. And this is somebody who's in, quote unquote, new media. You have to keep pummeling people with these horror stories, and they're horrible and they're going to feel bad. But this is how we change and sustain a change in public opinion. The terrible news is the horror stories are just going to grow because we have 22 states with extreme bans and restrictions. So as time goes on, the number of stories that we have been able to amplify will grow probably tenfold between now and the next major midterms and then presidential. So it's going to be an incredible organizing and investment opportunity, but we have to keep and challenge, I should say, but it's an opportunity to get these stories out there. And what was the second part of the question?
Strategy. What do you think is the biggest strategic opportunity?
Yeah, I mean, look, the federal level, it is making sure we take back the House. Republicans under Mike Johnson, I'm using Republicans and Democrats as shorthand because at the federal level, we have no Republican support for reproductive freedom, with the exception maybe of Lisa Murkowski in the Senate, who is not really a Republican anymore, even though she caucuses with Republicans. So we don't have a single Republican in the House who's voted on any common sense legislation supporting reproductive freedom. And you have a little bit of that difference in the state legislature, for example, in Arizona, but not at the federal level. So the Republicans hold the House by just a couple of seats. So in the midterm elections, we have a chance at flipping the House. In the Senate, we have at least 2 pickup opportunities. So that's coming up super fast.
Yep.
So the strategy is the federal level, gum up the system and slow down as much as possible Donald Trump and his appointees' abilities to do anything. That's through litigation. That's through organizing. That's through press and media and public opinion. We got to slow them down because, as you can see, they're trying to do shock and awe and move as much crazy stuff as possible. That then that shifts to, we got to win back as many seats as possible in the midterms. And then we've got to have an all-out war for the White House in 2028, which feels far away, but it's not. It's really only 3 years, if less than away. We count the primaries and how extensive those are going to be. And they're going to both be open seats, despite Donald Trump's assertion that maybe he should have a third term. That's not going to happen. We are not going to let that happen. But that organizing started already. Yeah. So that's the federal strategy. At the state level, it's going to be continuing to work with states like yours in Arizona, where you have a Democratic governor, a Democratic attorney general, a mixed legislature, to really stop the bleeding and do as much as you can. You passed a ballot measure. You already have folks trying to undo that work, but you've got enough Democrats to promulgate the promise of the ballot measure. So in those states like Michigan, Arizona, Missouri, places where we've passed ballot measures, but we don't have all the levers of power, it's going to be about doing everything we can to advance rights. And then the states where we have majorities of reproductive freedom champions, like some of the ones I mentioned prior, it's going to be about advancing as many rights as possible and really turbocharging them, right? In Minnesota, for example, we've got, Governor Tim Walz. They are investing, like New Mexico, they're investing in abortion access. They're building new clinics. J.B. Pritzker in Illinois is doing the same thing. He's like island of abortion care surrounded by really hostile states. He's working with his providers in the state to build clinics in the borders, but also to expand funding from the state for care. So there's a lot, even in our blue states, there's a lot we're not doing yet. So we've got to do everything we can where we can, slow the damage at the federal level, and fight back as hard as possible. It's also about working with Democratic attorneys general to be that front line of defense for those states from the incursion of like Republican red states. I'm sure you've been following, Texas and Louisiana. I mentioned it earlier, going after a doctor in New York for providing pills to the citizens of their state. So it's overwhelming. As I'm even saying it out loud, it's overwhelming.
It is.
But I'll simplify it because it is simple. Fight for as much as we can where we can in the blue states, in the purple states. Slow down the federal disaster as much as we possibly can and organize. And part of that means telling the stories of places like Arizona where you're doing great things, telling those stories to reshape the narrative of what it means to live in a place where Democrats are in control.
Yeah.
They've done a lot of damage to our brand, but we're actually living in a time where Democrats are doing really amazing things on one of the top issues Americans care about, reproductive freedom. We got to brag about it. We got to sell that story.
Yeah, I am completely aligned with that. I think storytelling is always, I really just believe storytelling is how we change the world. I think it's how we have the world we have now, and it's how we will have the world that we want. And that telling stories about the good stuff that's happening is just as important as telling stories about the
horror stories. It's like there's two sets of stories. They both have to be told.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Well, that really sets me up perfectly to ask you, for those listening, if they want to learn more about abortion advocacy, where is one place you would direct them where they can really learn?
Yeah, I mean, I'd welcome them to join us and check out our website. It's reproductivefreedomforall.org. You can sign up to be an advocate. You can learn digital organizing. You can, in our chapter states like Arizona, you can join our org. But if you don't want to do any of those things and you just want to sign up for the action alerts, you just want to learn what's happening in the news, you just want to follow all the updates on social media. My team's been very aggressively posting the records of every Trump nominee. We've been shedding a lot of light on all of these folks who some of them are not as famous as RFK Jr. Some of them are just sort of random, but they're dangerous. And we also post regularly and connect the dots with our partner organizations in the movement. There's dozens, if not more than that, of organizations across this country that do really powerful and important reproductive rights, health, and justice work. And we share their content all the time. So join us, go to our one-stop shop, and we will find ways to connect you to all the other wonderful resources as well.
That's awesome. And if there's a way that our audience or our listeners should think differently about this issue, what would that be?
Yeah, I mean, my shorthand continues to be to remember that we are the majority. Again, they try to gaslight us into thinking that we're, not. I find it very powerful and empowering to remember we're the majority and we have to start acting like it.
Yeah.
Like, why are you taking away a right that's so obvious?
Yeah.
Why are you taking away a right that all of us support? And remember, this is the first Trump administration since Dobbs. This is the first Trump administration since we've won the majority of state battles that have run on abortion. This is the first Republican trifecta in Congress and in the White House that is post us knowing that we have the majority of Republicans on our side on this issue too. So make them fight for what they want. Why are we should never be conceding any ground to them.
Yeah.
We're the majority. And that gives us a unique power in a moment where we feel powerless.
Yeah. And then what is one thing that people can do to join the movement for abortion advocacy?
I think a very simple thing to do, if you're not doing this already, obviously come to our website, take an action. We would love to have you, but find your local abortion fund and consider any level of contribution. Abortion funds are totally volunteer-driven organizations that raise money to help people who need abortion care. As I mentioned before, there's no federal funding for abortion care. It's been carved out for decades, which is really shameful and something we have to fix. Many states provide care and funds, but not at the federal level. So you have a lot of people who need care, and more than ever before, who are coming from states that don't have care into places like Arizona. So abortion funds in Arizona are now taking on the burden of getting people across state lines, covering their transportation, covering childcare, for example, and then actually covering the cost of the procedure. So if you can't be an activist, that's okay. Find a way to make any kind of contribution, and abortion funds are the most impactful way for you to give if you care about this issue.
I love that. Mini, thank you so much for this incredible conversation. It's been enlightening for me, and I'm sure it will have been the same for anyone listening, but also just thank you for the passion and the fire that you bring to the movement. I think that this work is hard. It's just really, really difficult. And being able to be that shining light for others when we're all feeling kind of beaten down is so incredibly invaluable. And I'm grateful for you.
Well, I'm grateful for that. I appreciate it. Here's what I'll say back. Thank you for having me, for shining a light, for giving us a platform to talk about this. But at the end of the day, what I say to my team and to myself when I'm having a hard day is we are lucky to be able to professionally do this fundamental, freedom fighting work. It's a privilege. It's a privilege. And every single person who supports our work, got to thank them tenfold, including you, because you just gave me a platform to talk about it, because we get to do this full time. What a gift.
What a gift.
So how can you not be energized by that?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Mini, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
There you have it. Another incredible conversation with a change maker who is truly shaping the world that we live in, and Mini is no exception. I hope that you took just as much away from that conversation as I did. And if you did, I have one special favor to ask you, is that you would leave a rating or a review on whatever platform you have listened to this podcast on. It really helps us to grow and to reach more change makers now more than ever. People driving social justice and systemic change in our communities need these stories that enable them to reconnect to what matters and take away tips and tricks and tools that they can apply in their work. And so I would love it if you would share this with someone you know and rate and review it. It helps us grow and get our beloved change makers the support and the inspiration that they need. Thank you so much for being here with me today. And until next time, when I cannot wait to share another story of change with you, have a great one.